hope of if there's a bipartisan solution. That was what John McCain was saying. We can't keep doing this. We can't keep changing things every time the administration changes. So if we come up with something together, we're both going to be invested in making sure it works. And so, I think the caller does strike a really good point there. It's too big to keep changing this often.
Last call, Ron, Dayton Beach, Florida, line for Republicans. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, one, I'm not in favor of a single payer. Mainly because Australia has that, Canada has that, I believe. Australia, I had a friend of mine living down there, and he went there for the insurance, and a can of Coke was like $5 for one can of Coke. They may have all the insurance, but they have all the costs that go with it. The other thing I see is that when you have states like Oregon that just implemented mandatory coverage of abortions for everybody at every income level, and they don't have to pay for it, but the insurance companies do. It just seems wrong that the whole thing is and I'm on Medicare, and I haven't used my Medicare for 15 years. I got hacked, and somebody else was using it. It took me 3 weeks to get that corrected. I'm just not a big fan of government running health care. I have Blue Cross Blue Shield right now that I use. The insurance company seems to do a damn good job. I got a bill for $1,600, and I only had to pay $363 on it. I just think the whole thing basically is a mess, but nobody seems to want to do anything about it. And the other thing is, once you get into these federal programs like Medicare, I've been paying a premium each month, actually. It's mandatory. I pay it. I can't get out of it. I've probably paid them $11,000 over the last 10 years or more.
Brian, can I jump in since we're running out of time? I want to ask you, would you be more confident in your state running that health care system than you are in the federal government? Do you think the state of Florida would do a better job?
Yeah, I really don't have a problem with the state running it. I really like the idea of state control. It's a lot easier for me to go grab a state senator and shake him by the bones than what I had to do to get my Medicare problem straightened out by going to the Medicare Association. And that whole issue with them was a pain. I had a friend of mine standing next to me, another 75-year-old guy, and this was when I was living in Oregon.
Well, Ron, we're going to have to let you go, Caitlin Owens. I'll give you the last 30 seconds before we got to end our program.
Yeah, I think as we keep talking about single payer going forward, I think it is something he raised. It's not free. Single payer costs money. It will almost certainly result in a tax increase. The question is, who is going to pay it?
Caitlin Owens is with Axios. It's Axios.com, healthcare reporter there. You can see all of her work. You can also follow her on Twitter at Caitlin Owens. Easy enough. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you for having me.
And that's going to do it for our program today on the Washington Journal. We'll be back here tomorrow morning, of course, at 7 a.m. Eastern, 4 a.m. Pacific. We now take you to Capitol Hill, where Energy and Commerce Democratic Ranking Member Frank Pallone of New Jersey and Judiciary Committee Ranking Member John Conyers will hold a joint forum to review recent studies highlighting the advances in sports research on traumatic brain injuries, starting in just a few moments here on C-SPAN.
We're live on Capitol Hill. The House is not in session, but Democrats on the Energy and Commerce Committee holding a meeting looking at a traumatic brain injury. They'll hear from medical officials, a couple of former NFL players and others. in a discussion that's set to last a couple of hours. We'll have live coverage here on C-SPAN. It's about to get underway. Frank Pallone, the ranking member on the Energy and Commerce Committee, is leading the meeting.
Thank you all for being here today. I want to thank all of our participants at this joint Energy and Commerce and Judiciary Committee Democratic Forum. And of course, I want to particularly thank our Judiciary Committee ranking member. I call him Chairman Conyers because he was the chairman when we were in the majority. I've never been in this position in the majority, so I can refer to you as chairman, but not myself. So thank you, Chairman Conyers, for joining us to examine the long-term impacts of repetitive brain trauma, in particular trauma associated with contact sports. And I look forward to engaging in a dialogue with our witnesses about this very important issue. Every week at this time of year, football players at all levels take the field and engage in a contact sport that they enjoy playing, but that may be harmful to their health in the future. There are a lot of concerning questions that we will discuss today. At the very least, athletes and their families need to know that they are being informed about the health risks and that the risks associated with contact sports are being mitigated to the greatest extent possible. With more and more research coming out, the evidence is becoming clearer and clearer. The effects of repeated head trauma, even those received during one's youth, can accumulate and cause serious and devastating conditions. And these conditions can stem from injuries once considered minor, known as subconcussive hits or repetitive hits to the head. Boston University researchers, led by our witnesses today, Dr. Ann McGee, Dr. Bob Stern, and Dr. Chris Nowinski, have found that exposure to hits, regardless of whether a concussion occurred, is associated with a markedly increased risk of mood disorders like depression. And these researchers have also repeatedly found evidence of a linkage between head impacts and CTE, a devastating degenerative brain disease. Most notably, in a major study released this summer, these researchers examined the brains of 111 deceased National Football League players whose families chose to donate their brains to the Boston University program, and the study showed that 110 of the deceased players suffered from CTE during their lifetimes. I'm pleased that we're joined by all three of these researchers who are conducting critically important research. Their research must be considered by athletic associations and others, including Congress, as we look for real solutions to this devastating disease. And I thank them for their invaluable contribution to this area and look forward to hearing more today. Beyond this research, there are a number of unanswered questions about what risk factors make individuals more susceptible to these debilitating conditions. We need to understand what happens to the brain when it's hit and how many hits trigger these neurological effects. We also need to investigate whether it's possible to diagnose CTE during life and what treatment should be offered to those struggling with cognitive issues due to cumulative brain trauma. And while there's still research that needs to be done, that should not be an excuse for inaction. What is not in dispute is the association between head trauma from contact sports such as football and lasting brain damage and degenerative diseases like CTE. A number of our panelists today have played professional football or have family members who did. And I want to welcome former NFL players Harry Carson, who I've met before, DeAndre Levy, and Mike Adam Lee. We're also joined by Mr. Adam Lee's wife, Kim Adam Lee, and Dr. Eleanor Perfetto, who was a widow of the late NFL player Ralph Wenzel. They have witnessed firsthand the long-term exposure or the long-term effects of exposure to repetitive head impacts. They can speak to the challenges they live with and have witnessed as a result of this trauma. And they can also speak to the concerns for the future and whether they believe they will be adequately supported by the NFL or other organizations as they face future challenges. And I'd also like to mention that we invited the NFL to attend, but they declined. The science has raised enough red flags about the dangers of repetitive head trauma that I think it's incumbent upon those who organize and promote contact sports to take every effort to make the games as safe as possible. That commitment must come from all levels of play, including from the highest level of football. Since the NFL recognizes the link between repetitive hits and brain trauma, they need to commit to supporting independent research, meaningfully reducing the risks, and supporting players suffering from the effects of long-term brain injury. So this forum is critically important. It's unfortunate, however, that this discussion is not being conducted in a formal congressional hearing. Despite our repeated requests for a series of hearings on this subject last year, the Republican majority agreed to one hearing during the last Congress on concussions in youth sports, and that's simply not enough. But I'm hopeful that today's forum will help us build momentum for further action and discussion. I thank you again to all our witnesses for your contributions or for being here for this important discussion on traumatic brain injuries in athletics. And I hope we can all continue to work together to find the best ways to address this significant public health issue. I'm not going to mention my colleagues by name because they're each going to be part of this forum and discussion, but I do want to say that looking at the people that are up here, my colleagues that are up here, really many of them have played a major role in dealing with issues, so I appreciate the fact that they're here today. So let me call on I call him Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Congressman Conyers, for an opening statement. Thank you for letting us use your room as well.
Oh, you'll get the bill. Top of the morning, everybody. What a pleasure it is to be here with our Energy and Commerce ranking member, Frank Pallone, and all my colleagues in sponsoring this event. It's an important event, and it's taken a little while to get there, and we've got a long way to go. Today's forum brings together some of the nation's leading experts from the medical research and athletic communities to review the causes, effects, and treatments of concussions and other head trauma. In particular, the forum examines what is known about brain injuries, what gaps exist in scientific literature, and what is being done to address those gaps. The following year, the Judiciary Committee it will also feature first-hand accounts from individuals who suffered from subconcussive trauma or have witnessed its long-term effects on their loved ones. And that's why we have 8 people, 2, 4, 6. We have this is a very unusual forum, and I'm glad of it. When I was chairman of Judiciary Committee, we held a hearing in 2009 on football head injuries, which was prompted by the mounting scientific evidence connecting head injuries in football and cognitive problems later on in life. During that hearing, the National Football League refused to acknowledge a connection between head injuries on the football field and the subsequent development of brain diseases. The following year, the Judiciary Committee held a hearing in Detroit, Michigan, followed by forums in Houston and New York City as part of our ongoing commitment to calling attention to this problem and examining ways to prevent head injuries in youth, high school, and in college football as well. And this brings us to today's forum, where our medical panelists will discuss their recently published studies examining the brains of 111 deceased National Football League players, which found that an astounding 110 of them had chronic traumatic encephalopathy, also known as CTE for short. Although scientific evidence clearly links head injuries in football to cognitive problems later in life, between 1.6 million and 3.8 million sports and recreational-related concussions occur each year, according to the Center for Disease Control. The extent of injury is particularly problematic for our youth, as most brains are not fully developed until 25 years of age. As a result, a concussion is more dangerous for youth than it is for an adult. And so I hope the panelists today will provide guidance on how we can better protect all athletes, especially our young athletes. And I would be remiss if I did not briefly comment concerning the President of the United States' recent series of statements concerning our nation's professional football players. At his rally in Alabama on September 22nd, he mocked the National Football League's efforts to prevent brain injuries, declaring, "Two guys, just really beautiful tackle. Boom. 15 yards. The referee goes on television. His wife's so proud of him. They're ruining the game. They're ruining the game." End of quotation. The President of the United States then went on to use the power of his and the Vice President's bully pulpits and Twitter feeds to rail against the right of private citizens to express their views and right to protest as guaranteed by, of course, the First Amendment's free speech protection. Ironically, President Trump has not uttered a single word about the actual underlying issue: the glaring disparities in how African Americans are dealt with under our criminal justice system and their treatment by law enforcement officers, which have often had deadly consequences. These are problems, by the way, which have gotten worse, not better, in my view, under the Trump administration and Sessions Department of Justice Department. Now, today's forum will allow us to return to the actual facts and evidence and consider how we can best protect football players at all levels in an incredibly violent sport. And so I thank all the panelists and the members for being here today, and I turn it back to Mr. Pallone, my colleague and friend.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you so much for your comments, and again for letting us have a place to have this forum today. I wanted to introduce the panelists, but normally members of Congress get to make opening statements when they come to these forums, and we're not doing that today because they've all agreed not to, in order so we could get to the panelists. But let me just at least introduce everybody up here, if I could. First on my left is Jen Schakowsky. She's a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. She's from Chicago, but she's probably done more on this issue than any other member. I have to be honest. She's just been out very concerned about this whole issue of concussion in sports and been out front on it from the beginning. To her left is Jerry McNierney from California, also a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And then to my right is Steve Cohen, who's from Memphis, outspoken on so many issues. I'll call you the investigative congressman, because you're always investigating everything very effectively. And then we have David Cicilline. Both of them are members of the Judiciary Committee, and David is the co-chair of our message, or what do we call it, Democratic Policy Group. And he plays a major role in getting our message and developing our policy. So on our panel, we have today Dr. Ann McGee. I guess I'm going from my left. Dr. Ann McGee, who's director of the CTE Center at Boston University. We have Dr. Robert Stern, who's director of clinical research for the Boston University CTE Center. Then we have Dr. Chris Nowinski, who's co-founder and CEO of the Concussion Legacy Foundation and co-founder of the Boston University CTE Center. Then we have Harry Carson, who is a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame and linebacker for the Super Bowl 21 winning New York Giants, who served as team captain of the Giants for 10 seasons. I guess you probably figured he's my favorite, so whatever. And then after that is DeAndre Levy, who was a starting linebacker for the Detroit Lions from 2009 through 2015. And then we have Mike Adam Lee, who was a record-setting fullback for Northwestern and played for the Chiefs, the Jets, and the Bears before entering into a 40-plus career in broadcasting, during which he worked for all of the major networks. And then we have his wife, Kim Adam Lee, who has supported Mike throughout his struggles with dementia, and she's an educational consultant and school psychology teacher with 3 decades of experience conducting cognitive assessments. And then last is Dr. Eleanor Perfetto, who's Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the National Health Council, and she was the caregiver for her spouse, Ralph Wenzel, prior to his death due to CTE. So thank you all. You're all such experts and personal knowledge of what we're dealing with today. I was going to start, I would like to have 2 people start, and that's Dr. Ann McGee first, if you would make a statement.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member Pallone, Ranking Member Conyers, and distinguished members of the committees. This is a great honor and a great pleasure to be here, and I'm going to try to summarize the work that we've done on CTE, as well as discuss 2 of our recent papers, and then Dr. Stern will discuss his research and his recent paper. So the first question is, what is CTE? CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, is a progressive neurodegenerative disease found in athletes and military veterans with a history of repetitive head trauma, including concussions and asymptomatic subconcussive hits to the head. CTE is increasingly recognized as a potential risk for athletes participating in contact sports such as American football, but also soccer, boxing, and ice hockey. Military veterans who are exposed to explosive blasts are also at risk for CTE. CTE is characterized by the buildup of an abnormal protein called tau in nerve cells and nerve cell processes in a unique pattern in the brain. CTE gradually interferes with normal brain functioning and may lead to changes in behavior such as impulsivity, explosivity, and violence, changes in mood such as depression and hopelessness, and cognitive changes such as memory loss and cognitive decline. At the current time, CTE can only be diagnosed after death by examination of the brain, and there are no known treatments for the disorder. Also unknown at this time is the exact prevalence of CTE in amateur and professional and contact sport athletes, as well as military veterans. Given that millions of contact sport athletes and military service members are exposed to repetitive head trauma every year, CTE has become a major public health concern. Over the last 9 years, there have been many advances in our understanding of CTE. My colleagues at VA Boston Healthcare System, Boston University, and the Concussion Legacy Foundation developed the largest brain bank in the world in 2008 to study the long-term effects of exposure to repetitive head trauma and CTE. The VA-BU CLF Brain Bank now contains the brains and spinal cords of over 450 athletes, military veterans, and civilians who experience repetitive head trauma. We've diagnosed CTE in over 280 individuals and published the clinical and pathological features of over 70% of the confirmed cases reported worldwide since CTE was first identified in 1928 by Harrison Martland and first named chronic traumatic encephalopathy by MacDonald Critchley in 1949. We reported the first case of CTE in high school football, college football, soccer, boxing, baseball, ice hockey, mixed martial arts, the youngest athlete to be diagnosed with CTE, and the first case series of CTE in military veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. We've published original articles on the relationship between CTE and the development of motor neuron disease, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. We've analyzed the roles of other proteins in CTE, including beta amyloid, alpha-synuclein, TDP-43, and we've begun to investigate how the abnormal tau protein in CTE spreads from one nerve cell to another to result in widespread disease. In 2013, we defined the pathological features for the diagnosis of CTE and developed a staging scheme to assess pathological severity. We now know there is a unique pathological hallmark of CTE. There is a hallmark tau lesion that does not exist in a normal brain or in any other neurodegenerative disease such as Alzheimer's disease. This hallmark CTE lesion allows for the precise pathological diagnosis of CTE. This unique lesion of CTE is present in small areas of the brain in the beginning of the disease, and it becomes widespread and distributed throughout the brain in advanced disease. Two consensus panels of expert neuropathologists sponsored by the National Institute of Neurologic Disease and Stroke and the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering have defined this lesion as a pathognomonic lesion, or a specific and diagnostic lesion for CTE. Research by biomedical engineers has also suggested that the reason tau is deposited in this unique pattern in CTE is that these are the brain regions that are subjected to the greatest stress and physical strain during head impact trauma. Data from our studies also indicate that the severity of CTE pathology increases with the length of a football player career or the number of years between starting to play and retirement from the sport. Recently, we reported the largest and most methodologically rigorous case series of individuals with CTE ever published in the journal JAMA. The clinical and neuropathological methods used in this study were superior to all previously published case series on CTE. A panel of 4 neuropathologists used the defined NINDS criteria to make the diagnosis of CTE without any knowledge of the clinical history, and the clinical case description was standardized, comprehensive, and performed blinded to the pathology and reviewed by a panel of clinicians. Not only did this JAMA study more than double the size of any previous case series, all the participants were exposed to a relatively similar type of head trauma experienced during the play of football. The case series included 202 American football players at all levels of play. Excuse me, I'm missing something. At all levels of play. And whose brains were donated for research. The study found that 177, or 87% of the brain donors were diagnosed with CTE using the strictly defined criteria. This included 3 of 14 high school players, high school only players, 3 of 14, 21%, 48 of 53 college football players, or 91%, and 110 of 111 NFL players, or 99%. The study also found that nearly all former NFL players had severe CTE, and in players with either mild or severe CTE, behavioral, mood, and cognitive problems were frequent. Dementia was common among those players with severe CTE. So what is the prevalence of CTE in the general population? The JAMA study was not a population study and cannot be used to determine how common CTE is in the general population. It was also not representative of all living football players, as most of the subjects in the study played football for long periods of time at high levels. However, the JAMA study does tell us, beyond any reasonable doubt, that people who play football for many years develop CTE much more often than people who do not. Now, what does the JAMA study indicate about the prevalence of CTE? The critical question is the denominator for the study. The denominator is not the approximately 20 million former football players in the general population, or 177 out of 20 million. The denominator for the JAMA study is the number of individuals who played football and died during the same study period. We don't know that number for former high school and college players, but Alan Schwartz, formerly of the New York Times, has provided the number of former NFL players who died during the study period, and that number is 1,300. So even if one makes the highly improbable assumption that all of the former NFL players whose brains were donated to our brain bank during the study period whose brains were not donated to our brain bank were negative for CTE, the minimum prevalence among former NFL players would be 10%. 10% is the minimum percentage it could possibly be, and it would be reasonable to assume that the actual percentage is much higher. The question then becomes, if a minimum of 10% of NFL players develop a devastating and progressive, untreatable disease as a result of playing football at the professional level, is that an acceptable risk? I think the answer to that is no. There is also the issue of selection bias in the JAMA study. In this study, as in all of our peer-reviewed published original articles, we were careful to acknowledge there is selection bias. That is, most of the football players' brains were donated by families who suspected that their loved ones had symptoms of CTE. It is important to emphasize that the brain bank team never asked the family about clinical symptoms before donation. The only question that is asked is whether or not the loved one was exposed to head trauma. However, we recognize that if a family suspects something is wrong with a loved one, or if a loved one died from suicide or accidental death, the family is much more likely to pursue brain donation. Yet remember, brain donor families are not skilled diagnosticians or medical professionals. The donor families have no laboratory tests or sophisticated methods to make a diagnosis of CTE. So despite their humble limitations, the donor families had a diagnostic accuracy rate of 87% for CTE in the JAMA study. 87% is a diagnostic accuracy rate that would be impressive, even for a tertiary medical center focused on neurodegenerative disease with all the state-of-the-art medical advances at their disposal. Furthermore, selection bias is a factor for donors to all sorts of brain banks, including our other brain banks like the BU Alzheimer Brain Bank and the Framingham Study Brain Bank. And yet fewer than 5% of those brain donors have been diagnosed with CTE. So these critical caveats and the fact that we've been able to amass 177 instances of CTE in football players over a brief 8-year period is an indication that CTE is not rare. CTE may be under-recognized, but it is certainly not rare. In addition, we found CTE, even very severe CTE, in individuals who only played football at the college level, and that's a cause for us all to be concerned. Our work on the neuropathological examination of brain donors has also led to advances in understanding and the diagnosis of CTE, advances that are beginning to lead to the identification of what we call novel biomarkers to detect CTE in living people, and we hope will also lead to new treatments for people suffering from CTE. The unique perivascular tau lesion, that pathognomonic CTE lesion, is associated with a robust and persistent inflammation. Our studies show that there is a significant increase in brain inflammation after exposure to football, and this inflammation increases further as CTE develops and becomes progressively more severe. In September 2017, my colleagues and I reported in the journal PLOS One that the inflammatory cytokine CCL11 was elevated in the brain tissue of former college and professional football players compared to non-athletes with Alzheimer's disease and non-athlete controls. We also took postmortem samples of cerebral spinal fluid from individuals with CTE controls and Alzheimer's disease and found that the levels of CCL11 in the CSF were normal in the controls in Alzheimer's disease, but elevated in CTE, again suggesting that CCL11 in the CSF might be able to assist in the detection of CTE during life. These findings represent the early steps towards identifying CTE in living people and offer mechanistic insights into possible future treatments for CTE. Additional studies are needed and are being undertaken to validate this study, determine whether CCL11 can be detected in the spinal fluid or blood of living individuals at risk for CTE, and whether CCL11 levels can predict the severity of disease in living individuals. CTE is a risk for football players, especially football players who play a long time and at high level. CTE is a risk for all contact sport athletes, military veterans, and any individual who experiences repetitive head trauma, including concussions and subconcussions. We have made major advances at our understanding of CTE over the past 9 years, but to further accelerate critical knowledge in the prevalence of CTE, the prevention of CTE, the risk of exposure, the genetics of CTE, the diagnosis of CTE, and effective treatment for CTE, we will need additional research funding. CTE needs to be recognized as an Alzheimer-related neurodegeneration and as part of the National Research Action Plan. If we understand what goes wrong in the brain in CTE and leads to the buildup of the abnormal tau protein and speeds the deposition of other neurodegenerative proteins after head trauma, we will make enormous progress in the fight against all neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's disease and many other neurodegeneration. If we are truly concerned about the brain and mental health of future generations of Americans, including military service personnel, we will commit to additional research for funding for CTE. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McKee. Let me also mention that we've been joined by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas. Thank you for being with us. Now, just so you know, what we're going to do is we're going to hear next from Dr. Bob Stern. The rest of the panelists have agreed to not make opening statements, so we can go right to questions, and so that's what we'll do after Dr. Stern. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, Ranking Member Pallone, Ranking Member Conyers, and distinguished members of the committees. It is indeed a great honor to participate in this forum today. Since 2008, my research has focused on the long-term consequences of repetitive brain trauma in athletes, including this neurodegenerative disease, CTE. As you've heard from Dr. McKee, at this time, CTE can only be diagnosed after death through post-mortem neuropathological examination. Several important questions about CTE remain unanswered, such as how common is it? Why does one person get it and another person does not? And how can we differentiate CTE from other similar diseases and conditions with similar symptoms? And to answer all these and other really important questions, the ability to diagnose CTE during life is the critical next step. Our group at Boston University and other scientists from around the country are actively conducting research to develop methods to accurately diagnose CTE during life. I'm honored to be the lead investigator of a $16 million, 7-year longitudinal multi-center investigation funded by the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. That study brings together a network of approximately 50 investigators from around the country from 10 major research institutions. The study, referred to as the Diagnose CTE Research Project, is aimed at developing methods of diagnosing CTE during life. And we're studying several hundred former professional football players, former college football players, and men of the same age who never had any exposure to these repetitive hits or other brain trauma. All of these folks undergo extensive testing over a 3-day period at one of our 4 sites around the country and then return 3 years later for follow-up evaluation. We are developing, refining, and testing a variety of potential biological tests for CTE, including new experimental PET scans that allow us to actually see the buildup of that abnormal tau protein in the brain during life, as well as advanced MRI scans, spinal fluid measures, and new blood tests that may be able to detect the disease even before the symptoms begin. I'm confident that we will have an accurate method or methods to detect and diagnose CTE during life within the next 5 years. However, we cannot wait for the availability of these tests to begin to examine who may be at greatest risk for this devastating disease. Previous research shows that the brain undergoes key periods of development and maturation during childhood, and several brain structures and functions of the brain reached their peak development during the period leading up to age 12 in boys. Therefore, our group has conducted a series of research studies to examine if there may be a period of vulnerability during which exposure to repeated subconcussive trauma through the routine play of tackle football may result in later life neurological abnormalities. 3 of these peer-reviewed studies involved former NFL players between the ages of 40 and 69. We found that the former players who began playing tackle football prior to age 12 had significantly worse memory and other cognitive functioning, as well as abnormal MRI findings compared to those who started to play at age 12 or older. And the total number of years they played did not account for these findings. Rather, the earlier they started playing in childhood, the worse the problems in adulthood. But we also wanted to know if this age at first exposure to football was also important in the millions of people who only play football up through high school or up through college and didn't go on to play in the pros. In a recently published study, we found that participation in tackle football before age 12 increased the odds for later life clinically elevated depression scores by 3-fold and increased the odds for having problems with behavioral regulation by 2-fold. These findings were independent of the total number of years the participants played football through their life or at what level they played through, such as high school or college or the pros. In addition to the age of first exposure to tackle football, we've examined the relationship between the estimated total number of head impacts someone sustains playing football and later life problems. In a study published earlier this year, we found a strong dose-response relationship between the estimated total number of head impacts experienced through youth, high school, and college football, and the risk for developing cognitive, mood, and behavioral impairments later in life. In layman's terms, the more hits to the head a football player received, the more likely they were to have impaired thinking skills, as well as depression and behavioral regulation difficulties decades later. Now, it's really important to note that participation in sports and athletics during childhood can have many important benefits, including the development of teamwork, self-confidence, and social skills, not to mention the tremendous health benefits from exercise. Therefore, the goal should be to make sure that children can take advantage of all the benefits of sports participation without the risk of brain-related difficulties later in life. That's a difficult balance and requires a combination of unbiased scientific information and just plain common sense. In closing, I want to thank you for your interest in addressing this important issue and for your continued commitment toward protecting the health and safety of all athletes. I also want to express my gratitude toward Congress in general for continued support of NIH funding, but also to underscore the need for expanded funding for brain research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stern. Let me explain that the rest of the panel are going to be answering questions and shouldn't hesitate if the question isn't directed to you and you want to answer it, please, indicate that you'd like to. And in terms of our questions, it's going to be the two of us as the co-chairs or whatever, and then we're going to go based on seniority with the rest of you, okay? What'd you say? No, I said seniority, not civility. Although are those civilities important, as you often mention to me? I'm sorry, Steve. All right. So let me start out. In recent years, we have seen sports teams and leagues recognizing the potential dangers of concussions by attempting to develop rules and protocol to make sports safer for participants. Such approaches include additional medical evaluations if a hard hit to the head occurs, or prohibiting certain types of activities such as head-to-head tackles. But this focus on concussions seems to obscure the more important issue. That is, there's a growing body of research that continuous or sustained subconcussive hits may contribute more to long-term brain injury than periodic concussions. And I think both Dr. McGee and Dr. Stern have indicated that. So let me start out with them. Dr. McGee, can you tell us what the evidence shows about the effect of subconcussive hits on the brain? Have subconcussive hits, even in the absence of a concussion diagnosis, been linked to decreased cognitive functioning or changes in brain chemistry?
So what we know from our postmortem studies is that 20% of the individuals who played football developed CTE never had a reported concussion. What we've found over and over, it's the length of their playing career or their exposure to football and the many hits that occur on every play of the game. It's this dose response to the years of playing football that increase the risk for CTE. Others have shown this too. They've looked at high school athletes playing football, soccer, as well as ice hockey, and they find that even in the absence of a concussion, those individuals, if you look at those individuals at the beginning of the playing season and then look at them again at the end of the playing season, there will be changes in their white matter on sophisticated neuroimaging. There will be changes in their cognitive function, and this provides evidence that it's the low-level hits, the routine hits, especially that occur in football nearly on every play of the game, that lead to long-term changes and also increase the risk for CTE.
Well, thank you. Now, let me ask you and Dr. Stern, I understand that professional football players can get more than 1,000 subconcussive hits in a single season of play. According to some estimates, players get hit hundreds of times per season, even at the youth and high school level. So even if a football player is never diagnosed with a concussion, why should we be concerned about this volume of subconcussive hits? Either one of you. Dr. Stern?
Let's make it bring it down to the youth level. There was a study published a little less than a year ago, not from our group, that looked at kids, youth football players, between the ages of around 8 and 13. And they put accelerometer gizmos inside their helmets to measure the number and severity of the hits that they got. But all those kids also had MRI scans done before the season and after the season. And they took out any kid who had a diagnosed concussion. So it was only looking at the routine play without anyone who had a concussion. And what they found was that the total exposure to hits, the routine exposure to hits, the subconcussive trauma, was directly associated with changes to the white matter of the brain in just one season of play. That's the little kids. There's been multiple other studies looking at high school students, college students, after just one season of play, alterations in the structures of the brain, in the functioning of the brain, in the cognitive functioning. That's just the immediate short-term complications. But as Dr. McKee has pointed out, later on in life, we see both in living players and also in the deceased players that Dr. McKee examines that there's this relationship between the total exposure to playing football and when we try to estimate the total number of hits, between those number of hits they've received throughout their life and even changes in blood tests of tau, and changes in the MRI, and especially problems with thinking and memory.
Now, what about the connection between these subconcussive hits and CTE? Either of you want to answer that?
Well, again, it's the same. It's really what we're finding is a dose response, best measured as number of playing years. That the longer you play football, the higher your risk for CTE, and the higher the severity of the CTE. We're working on this risk profile. That's something that we think is immediately very important in terms of developing some guidelines for length of play that might be safe and when you're heading into a more high-risk category. But we're not there yet.
Now, I don't know if you can answer this, but the concern, of course, is, subconcussive versus concussions. In other words, how do they compare in terms of the risks in a sport like football? Or can you answer that?
It's really important to understand that there isn't a very clear diagnosis of what a concussion is. It's a clinical diagnosis at this point. There's no test that specifically says this person's has had a concussion. And so there's this continuum of what's going on in the brain and in the brain cells that result in the symptoms that are associated with concussion that leads to the diagnosis. If you don't have those symptoms, you can't be diagnosed with a concussion at this point. But that may still be doing something to those brain cells, whether temporarily or with enough of them, one after another, it may lead to long-term consequences.
And then it's possible that somebody who never had a concussion but just played one season because of the number of subconcussive hits could actually have significant changes to their brain, I guess, huh?
One season of play, I'm not that concerned about. We don't know, though. We just don't know. But the combination of the duration that someone plays, the number of hits they get while they're playing, based perhaps on the position that they play, the age that they started, all those things come together. We're trying to figure out exactly what that magic combination is that leads to later life problems.
All right, lastly, Dr. Stern, your group recently published a study concluding that participation in tackle football before age 12 greatly increases the risk of developing cognitive issues. I don't know what's going on. Is it me?
Bad microphone somewhere. Jerry Jones.
We'll try again. Oh, all right. I guess. Is that one? Guess so. So, your group recently published a study concluding that participation in tackle football before age 12 greatly increases the risk of developing cognitive issues later in life. And in a separate study, you also found that the more hits a player received, whether through youth, high school, or college, the more likely that player was to struggle with mood and behavioral impairments later in life. So, Dr. Stern, just talk about how much of a concern these subconcussive hits are for, particularly young football players before age 12, or either of you. Are the measures taken thus far? Let me just ask about the young people, because that's my particular concern.
There are so many questions we don't have answers for at this point. There's growing evidence. Time after time, papers are coming out suggesting that having your head hit over and over again as a child may have short-term and possibly long-term consequences. I guess the point I would make is that does it make sense to have our kids be exposed to those types of hits? I take off my science hat and put on my parent hat and say, we parents do a lot of things to protect our children. We do everything we can to keep them healthy, to have them stay away from injury, to reach their full potential. And then we let them off at a playing field at age 6, 7, 8, put on a big helmet with a face mask that makes them a bobblehead and say, go at it. Hit your head over and over and over again against your teammates, your opponents, the ground, at a time when we know the brain is going through this incredible development. Does that make sense if that brain is getting moved around, jolted around, that brain that really is the most precious organ in our body? Does it make sense as parents to do that? Regardless of what the current scientific knowledge is, does it make sense? The thing is, we are getting more science. We're getting more understanding that it does have an impact later on.
All right, and then if I could issue, Dr. McGee, last thing. Are there measures taken thus far by the NFL enough to reduce the risk to professional athletes posed by these repetitive hits to the head?
Well, so the issue is with the NFL, there's been such a focus on concussion and concussion awareness, and all of those efforts are, to be applauded. But the real issue with NFL and college level football and youth football is the routine hits that occur on every play of the game to nearly every player on the field. And that's what, that we haven't seen much change in terms of the NFL. We need to really think about keeping contact fully out of practice. We need to reduce head hits by stylistic and behavioral changes to the game. We actually need to start thinking about some very severe changes to the game so that the players wouldn't be having collisions and tackles on every play of the game. That's the issue in football. Collisions, tackles, and subconcussive hits are an intrinsic part of the sport. In another sport, it's a more random effect, but in football, just like in boxing, it's intrinsic. And that is what the NFL has not dealt with to date.
Well, thank you. Chairman Conyers.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pallone. This is, I want to get to a part of this and involve former linebacker DeAndre Levy and get some of you players, ex-players into this. You stated in a Detroit Free Press letter that you believe that football players are, quote, almost numb to the risk of CTE because it's part of the job. I think we as players have to acknowledge it and talk about it in a real way and demand answers. Would you comment, please?
Yeah. What led me to saying that was a conversation I had in the locker room with 8 or 9 guys. The locker room is a loose environment. We joke a lot. So, we joke about memories or issues we have with our memory, like our partners at home telling us something 3-4 times, like we all chime in and we relate to that, And not one of the players knew about the links, about any of the research that we're finding out, that this could very well be something more than just forgetfulness, And I pulled a couple guys to the side and we talk about some of the emotional issues we have, some of the mood swings, some of the highs and lows that we just come and go. And I think a lot of times we use football kind of as the guard and, maybe say, okay, this is just a part of the season. This is just a part of something it's just normal. We think it's normal because that's just, I don't know, that's just how we operate. Football is kind of a different culture. But it bothered me that not one player knew anything about the CTE research. I mean, we see the headlines, but unless we're cued in and paying attention to it, I don't think a lot of guys will be able to link them. For a long time, I was unable to link it. I had memory issues. I had times during the day, during the week, where my mood just switches, and I don't know why. And I can't control it. I can't come out of a funk. It's like a fog over me. And a lot of guys, I think, have the same issue, but they don't know how to link it. And, we don't talk about emotional issues, for the most part in the locker room. A guy isn't going to come in and tell you that he's feeling depressed or he's feeling anxious or he's feeling sad and he doesn't know why.
Do you think that players are aware of the risk associated with playing football?
I think we're aware that we'll have bad shoulders, we'll have bad backs, we'll have bad knees. I think a lot of us kind of know that that's par for the course. I think, speaking for myself and just conversations I've had with guys that have played professionally, high school, collegiate, I think for the longest, a concussion to us was just a headache. It was a headache that if you can play through, you're good. Once it's gone, And I think a lot of guys still have that mentality and still think about it. And I think there's a good portion of guys that don't want to think about it because honestly, it's frightening, to consider that you know, when 10 years down the line, when you're done playing, that you could be a completely different person. You could slowly decline or, you know, rapidly decline. I think when you're going out there pursuing your dream, trying to provide from your family, try to create some financial freedom for your family, you don't want to go out there and be scared or timid and think about the long-term effects. I think a lot of guys will intentionally put it out.
Does anything occur to any of you about what needs to be done to raise the awareness of this issue?
I think that every parent should be fully informed with all of the information that has been disseminated through Boston University or other sources. They should be informed as to what risks they are subjecting their kids to. Any football player that you ask, or anyone who has played football, because I'm sort of a little different. I played football, but I was never really a football player. And so I've always sort of looked at my life as something, you know, football is something very, very temporary. And the issues that are there are issues that start when you're young. Parents should understand that there's a physical risk that you assume